Down and out in Paris and London. We have finally reached our last installment. It's going to be a long one, so settle in, get yourself a nice drink, whatever your libation of choice is, and we will begin. Chapter 30. The next morning, we began looking once more for Paddy's friend, who was called Bozo, and was a screever, that is, a pavement artist. Addresses did not exist in Paddy's world, but he had a vague idea that Bozo might be found in Lambeth. And in the end, we ran across him on the embankment, where he had established himself not far from Waterloo Bridge. He was kneeling on the pavement with a box of chalks, copying a sketch of Winston Churchill from a penny notebook. The likeness was not bad at all. Bozo was a small, dark, hook-nosed man with curly hair growing low on his forehead. His right leg was dreadfully deformed, the foot being twisted, heel forward, in a horrible way to see. From his appearance, one could have taken him for a Jew, but he used to deny this vigorously. He spoke of his hook nose as Roman, and was proud of his resemblance to some Roman emperor. It was Vespasian, I think. Bozo had a strange way of talking, cockneyfied and yet very lucid and expressive. It was as though he had read good books, but had never troubled to correct his grammar. For a while, Paddy and I stayed on the embankment talking, and Bozo gave us an account of the screeving trade. I repeat what he said, more or less in his own words. I'm what they call a serious screever. I don't draw on blackboard chalks like these others. I use proper colours, same as what painters use. Bloody expensive they are, especially the reds. I use 5 bobs worth of colours in a long day, and never less than 2 bobs worth. Cartoons is my line, you know. Politics and cricket and that. Look here. He showed me his notebook. Here's likenesses of all the political blokes what I've copied from the papers. I have a different cartoon every day. For instance, when the budget was on, I had one of Winston trying to push an elephant marked debt, and underneath I wrote, Willy Budget. See? You have cartoons about any of the parties, but you mustn't put anything in favour of socialism, because the police won't stand for it. Once, I did a cartoon of a boa constrictor named Capital swallowing a rabbit named Labour. The copper came along and saw it, and he says, You rub that out and look sharp about it, he says. I had to rub it out. The copper's got the right to move you on loitering, and it's no good giving them a back answer. Pavement artists buy their colours in the form of powder and work them into cakes in condensed milk. I asked Bozo what he could earn at screeving, and he said, This time of year, when it don't rain, I take about 3 quid between Friday and Sunday. People get their wages Fridays, you see. I can't get work when it rains. The colours get washed off straight away. Take the year round. I make about £1 a week, 'cause you can't do much in the winter. Boat race day and cup final day, I've took as much as £4, but you have to cut it out of them, you know. You don't take a bob if you sit and look at 'em. A halfpenny is the usual drop, and you don't get even that unless you give 'em a bit of butt chat. Once they've answered you, they feel ashamed not to give you a drop. The best thing's to keep changing your picture, because when they see you drawing, they'll stop and watch you. The trouble is, the beggars scatter as soon as you turn around with the hat. You really want an assistant at this game. You keep at work and get a crowd watching you, and the nobber comes round casual like, round the back of 'em. They don't know he's the nobber. Then, suddenly, he pulls his cap off, and you got 'em between 2 fires like. You'll never get a drop off real toffs. It's shabby sort of blokes you get most off of, and foreigners. I've even 6pences off Japs and blackies, in fact. They're not so bloody mean as what an Englishman is. Another thing to remember is to keep your money covered up. except perhaps a penny in the hat. People won't give you anything if they think you got a bob or two already. Bozo had the deepest contempt for the other screevers on the embankment. He called them the salmon platers. At that time, there was a screever almost every 25 yards along the embankment, 25 yards being the recognized minimum between pitches. Bozo contemptuously pointed out an old, white-bearded screever 50 yards away. "You see that silly old fool? He's been doing the same picture every day for 10 years. A faithful friend, he calls it. It's of a dog pulling a child out of the water. Silly old bastard can't draw any better than a child of 10. He's learned just that one picture by rule of thumb, like you learn to put a puzzle together. There's a lot of that sort of thing about here. They come pinching my ideas sometimes, but I don't care. The silly shits can't think of anything for themselves, so I'm always ahead of them. The whole thing with cartoons is being up to date. Once a child got its head stuck in the railings of Chelsea Bridge. Well, I heard about it, and my cartoon was on the pavement before they got the child's head out of the railings. Prompt I am." Bozo seemed an interesting man, and I was anxious to see more of him. That evening I went down to the embankment to meet him, as he'd arranged to take Paddy and myself to a lodging house south of the river. Bozo washed his pictures off the pavement and counted his takings. It was about 16 shillings, of which he said 12 or 13 would be profit. We walked down into Lambeth. Bozo limped slowly with a queer, crab-like gait, half sideways, dragging his smashed foot behind him. He carried a stick in each hand and slung his box of colours over his shoulder. As we were crossing the bridge, he stopped in one of the alcoves to rest. He felt silent for a minute or two, and to my surprise, I saw that he was looking at the stars. He touched my arm and pointed to the sky with his stick. "Say, will you look at Aldebaran? Look at that colour. Like a great blood orange." From the way he spoke, he might have been an art critic in a picture gallery. I was astonished. I confess that I did not know which Aldebaran was. Indeed, I had never even noticed that the stars were of different colours. Bozo began to give me some elementary hints on astronomy, pointing out the chief constellations. He seemed concerned at my ignorance. I said to him, surprised, "You seem to know a lot about stars." "Not a great lot. I know a bit, though. I got 2 letters from the Astronomer Royal thanking me for writing about meteors. Now and again I go out at night and watch for the meteors. The stars are a free show. It don't cost anything to use your eyes." What a good idea. I should never have thought of it. Well, you got to take an interest in something. It don't follow that 'cause a man's on the road he can't think of anything but tea and 2 slices. But isn't it very hard to take an interest in things? Things like stars, living this life. Screeving, you mean? Not necessarily. It don't need you turn into a bloody rabbit, that is, not if you set your mind to it. It seems to have that effect on most people. Of course. Look at Paddy, a tea-swilling old moocher, only fit to scrounge for faggots. That's the way most of them go. I despise them. But you don't need to get like that. If you've got any education, it don't matter to you if you're on the road for the rest of your life. Well, I found just the contrary, I said. It seems to me that when you take a man's money away, he's fit for nothing from that moment. No, not necessarily. If you set yourself to it, you can live the same life, rich or poor. You can still keep on with your books and your ideas. You got to say to yourself, "I'm a free man in here." He tapped his forehead. "And you're all right." Bozo talked further in the same strain, and I listened with attention. He seemed a very unusual screever, and he was, moreover, the first person I had heard maintain that poverty did not matter. I saw a good deal of him during the next few days, for several times it rained and he could not work. He told me the history of his life, and it was a curious one. The son of a bankrupt bookseller, he had gone to work as a house painter at 18, and then served 3 years in France and India during the war. After the war, he had found a house painting job in Paris, and had stayed there several years. France suited him better than England. He despised the English. And he had been doing well in Paris, saving money, engaged to a French girl. One day, the girl was crushed to death under the wheels of an omnibus. Bozo went on the drink for a week, and then returned to work rather shaky. The same morning he fell from a stage on which he was working, 40 feet onto the pavement, and smashed his right foot to pulp. For some reason he received only £60 compensation. He returned to England, spent his money in looking for jobs, tried hawking books in the Middlesex street market, then tried selling toys from a tray, and finally settled down as a screever. He had lived hand to mouth ever since, half starved throughout the winter and often sleeping in the spike or on the embankment. When I knew him, he owned nothing but the clothes he stood up in, and his drawing materials and a few books. The clothes were the usual beggar's rags, but he wore a collar and tie, of which he was rather proud. The collar, a year or more old, was constantly going round the neck, and Bozo used to patch it with bits cut from the tail of his shirt, so that the shirt had scarcely any tail left. His damaged leg was getting worse, and would probably have to be amputated, and his knees, from kneeling on the stones, had pads of skin on them as thick as boot soles. There was clearly no future for him but beggary, and a death in the workhouse. With all this, he had neither fear nor regret nor shame nor self-pity. He had faced his position and made a philosophy for himself. Being a beggar, he said, was not his fault, and he refused either to have any compunction about it or to let it trouble him. He was the enemy of society, and quite ready to take to crime if he saw a good opportunity. He refused on principle to be thrifty. In the summer he saved nothing, spending his surplus earnings on drink, as he did not care about women. If he was penniless, when winter came on, then society must look after him. He was ready to extract every penny he could from charity, provided that he was not expected to say thank you for it. He avoided religious charities, however, for he said it stuck in his throat to sing hymns for buns. He had various other points of honor, for instance. It was his boast that never in his life, even when starving, had he picked up a cigarette end. He considered himself in a class above the ordinary run of beggars, who, he said, were an abject lot, without even the decency to be ungrateful. He spoke French passably, and had read some of Zola's novels, all Shakespeare's plays, Gulliver's Travels, and a number of essays. He could describe his adventures in words that one remembered. For instance, speaking of funerals, he said to me, "Have you ever seen a corpse burned? I have, in India. They put the old chap on the fire, and the next moment I almost jumped out of my skin because he started kicking. It was only his muscles contracting in the heat. Still, it gave me a turn. Well, he wriggled about for a bit, like a kipper on hot coals, and then his belly blew up and went off with a bang you could have heard 50 yards away. It fair put me against cremation." Or again, apropos of his accident, "Doctor says to me, 'You fell on one foot, my man, and bloody lucky for you didn't fall on both feet.' He says, 'Because if you'd fallen on both feet, you would have shut up like a bloody concertina and your thigh bones be sticking out of your ears.'" Clearly, the phrase was not the doctor's, but Bozo's own. He had a gift for phrases. He had managed to keep his brain intact and alert, and so nothing could make him succumb to poverty. He might be ragged and cold, or even starving, but so long as he could read, think, and watch for meteors, he was, as he said, free in his own mind. He was an embittered atheist, the sort of atheist who does not so much disbelieve in God as personally dislike him, and took a sort of pleasure in thinking that human affairs would never improve. Sometimes, he said, when sleeping on the embankment, it had consoled him to look up at Mars or Jupiter and think that there were probably embankment sleepers there. He had a curious theory about this. Life on Earth, he said, is harsh because the planet is poor in the necessities of existence. Mars, with its cold climate and scanty water, must be far poorer, and life correspondingly harsher. Whereas on Earth you are merely imprisoned for stealing 6 pence. On Mars you're probably boiled alive. This thought cheered Bozo. I do not know why. He was a very exceptional man. Chapter 31. The charge at Bozo's lodging house was 9 pence a night. It was a large, crowded place with accommodation for 500 men and a well-known rendezvous of tramps, beggars, and petty criminals. All races, even black and white, mixed in it on terms of equality. There were Indians there, and when I spoke to one of them in bad Urdu, he addressed me as Turn, a thing to make one shudder, if it had been in India. We had got below the range of color prejudice. One had glimpses of curious lives. Old Grandpa, a tramp of 70 who made his living, or a great part of it, by collecting cigarette ends and selling the tobacco at 3 pence an ounce. The doctor, he was a real doctor, who had been struck off the register for some offense, and besides selling newspapers, gave medical advice at a few pence a time. A little Chittagodian lascar, barefoot and starving, who had deserted his ship and wandered for days through London, so vague and helpless that he did not even know the name of the city he was in. He thought it was Liverpool, until I told him. A begging letter writer, a friend of Bozo's, who wrote pathetic appeals for aid to pay for his wife's funeral, and when a letter had taken effect, blew himself out with huge solitary gorges of bread and margarine. He was a nasty, hyena-like creature. I talked to him and found that, like most swindlers, he believed a great part of his own lies. The lodging house was an Alsatia for types like that. While I was with Bozo, he taught me something about the technique of London begging. There is more in it than one might suppose. Beggars vary greatly, and there is a sharp social line between those who merely cadge and those who attempt to give some value for money. The amounts that one can earn by the different gags also vary. The stories in the Sunday papers about beggars who die with £2,000 sewn into their trousers are, of course, lies. But the better-class beggars do have runs of luck when they earn a living wage for weeks at a time. The most prosperous beggars are street acrobats and street photographers. On a good pitch, a theater cue for instance, a street acrobat will often earn £5 a week. Street photographers can earn about the same, but they are dependent on fine weather. They have a cunning dodge to stimulate trade. When they see a likely victim approaching, one of them runs behind the camera and pretends to take a photograph. Then, as the victim reaches them, they exclaim, "There you are, sir. Took your lovely photo." "That'll be a bob." "But I never asked you to take it," protests the victim. "What? You didn't want it took? Why, as I thought you signalled with your hand, and there's a plate wasted. That's cost us a pence, that has." At this, the victim usually takes pity and says he will take the photo after all. The photographers examine the plate and say that it is spoiled and that they will take a fresh one free of charge. Of course, they have not really taken the first photo, and so, if the victim refuses, they waste nothing. Organ grinders like acrobats are considered artists rather than beggars. An organ grinder named Shorty, a friend of Bozo's, told me all about his trade. He and his mate worked the coffee shops and public houses round Whitechapel and the Commercial Road. It is a mistake to think that organ grinders earn their living in the street. 9/10 of their money is taken in coffee shops and pubs. Only the cheap pubs, for they are not allowed into good class ones. Shorty's procedure was to stop outside a pub and play one tune, after which his mate, who had a wooden leg and could excite compassion, went in and passed round the hat. It was a point of honor with Shorty always to play another tune after receiving the drop. An encore, as it were. The idea being that he was a genuine entertainer and not merely paid to go away. He and his mate took £2 or £3 a week between them. But as they had to pay 15 shillings a week for the hire of the organ, they only averaged £1 a week each. They were on the streets from 8 in the morning till 10 at night, and later on Saturdays. Screevers can sometimes be called artists, sometimes not. Bozo introduced me to one who was a real artist. That is, he had studied art in Paris and submitted pictures to the Salon in his day. His line was copies of old masters, which he did marvelously, considering that he was drawing on stone. He told me how he began as a screever. My wife and kids were starving. I was walking home late at night with a lot of drawings I'd been taking around the dealers and wondering how the devil trades a barber too. Then, in the Strand, I saw a fellow kneeling on the pavement drawing and people giving him pennies. As I came past, he got up and went into the pub. Damn it, I thought. If he can make money at that, so can I. So, on the impulse, I knelt down and began drawing with his chalks. Heaven knows how I came to do it. I must have been light-headed with hunger. The curious thing was that I'd never used pastels before. I had to learn the technique as I went along. Well, people began to stop and say that my drawing wasn't bad. And they gave me 9p between them. At this moment, the other fellow came out of the pub. "What in are you doing on my pitch?" he said. I explained that I was hungry and had to earn something. "Oh," said he, "come and have a pint with me." So I had a pint, and since that day I've been a screever. I make £1 a week. You can't keep 6 kids on £1 a week, but luckily my wife earns a bit taking in sewing. The worst thing in this life is the cold, and the next worst is the interference you have to put up with. At first, not knowing any better, I used sometimes to copy a nude on the pavement. The first I did was outside St. Martin's in the Fields Church. A fellow in black, I suppose he was a church warden or something, came out in a tearing rage. "Do you think we can have that obscenity outside God's holy house?" he cried. So I had to wash it out. It was a copy of Botticelli's Venus. Another time I copied the same picture on the embankment. A policeman passing looked at it and then, without a word, walked onto it and rubbed it out with his great flat feet. Bozo told the same tale of police interference. At the time when I was with him, there had been a case of immoral conduct in Hyde Park, in which the police had behaved rather badly. Bozo produced a cartoon of Hyde Park with policemen concealed in the trees, and the legend, "Puzzle, find the policeman." I pointed out to him how much more telling it would be to put "puzzle, find the immoral conduct," but Bozo would not hear of it. He said that any policeman who saw it would move him on, and he would lose his pitch for good. Below screevers come the people who sing hymns or sell matches or bootlaces or envelopes containing a few grains of lavender, called, euphemistically, perfume. All these people are frankly beggars, exploiting an appearance of misery, and none of them takes on an average more than £0.50 a day. The reason why they have to pretend to sell matches and so forth instead of begging outright is that this is demanded by the absurd English laws about begging. As the law now stands, If you approach a stranger and ask him for 2 pence, he can call a policeman and get you 7 days for begging. But if you make the air hideous by droning, "Nearer, my God, to thee," or scroll some chalk daubs on the pavement, or stand about with a tray of matches, in short, if you make a nuisance of yourself, you are held to be following a legitimate trade and not begging. Match selling and street singing are simply legalized crimes. Not profitable crimes, however. There's not a singer or match seller in London who can be sure of £50 a year. A poor return for standing 84 hours a week on the curb with the cars grazing your backside. It is worth saying something about the social position of beggars, for when one has consorted with them and found that they are ordinary human beings, one cannot help being struck by the curious attitude that society takes toward them. People seem to feel that there is some essential difference between beggars and ordinary working men. They are a race apart, outcasts like criminals and prostitutes. Working men work, beggars do not work. They are parasites, worthless in their very nature. It is taken for granted that a beggar does not earn his living as a bricklayer or a literary critic earns his. He is a mere social excrescence, tolerated because we live in a humane age, but essentially despicable. Yet, if one looks closely, one sees that there is no essential difference between a beggar's livelihood and that of numberless respectable people. Beggars do not work, it is said, but then what is work? A navvy works by swinging a pick. An accountant works by adding up figures. A beggar works by standing out of doors in all weathers and getting varicose veins, chronic bronchitis, etc. It is a trade like any other, quite useless, of course, but then many reputable trades are quite useless. And as a social type, a beggar compares well with scores of others. He is honest compared with the sellers of most patent medicines, high-minded compared with a Sunday newspaper proprietor, amiable compared with a hire purchase tout. In short, a parasite, but a fairly harmless parasite. He seldom extracts more than a bare living from the community, and what should justify him according to our ethical ideas, he pays for it over and over in suffering. I do not think there is anything about a beggar that sets him in a different class from other people, or gives most modern men the right to despise him. Then the question arises, why are beggars despised? For they are despised universally. I believe it is for the simple reason that they fail to earn a decent living. In practice, nobody cares whether work is useful or useless, productive or parasitic. The sole thing demanded is that it shall be profitable. In all the modern talk about energy, efficiency, social service, and the rest of it, what meaning is there except get money, get it legally, and get a lot of it? Money has become the grand test of virtue. By this test, beggars fail. For this, they are despised. If one could earn even £10 a week at begging, it would become a respectable profession immediately. A beggar, looked at realistically, is simply a businessman, getting his living like other businessmen, in the way that comes to hand. He has not, more than most modern people, sold his honor. He has merely made the mistake of choosing a trade at which it is impossible to grow rich. Chapter 32. I want to put in some notes, as short as possible, on London slang and swearing. These, omitting the ones that everyone knows, are some of the cant words now used in London. A gagger, beggar or street performer of any kind. A moocher, one who begs outright without pretense of doing a trade. A nobbier, one who collects pennies for a beggar. A chanter, a street singer. A clodhopper, a street dancer. A mug faker, a street photographer. A glimmer, one who watches vacant motor cars. A G, or G, it is pronounced G, the accomplice of a cheapjack, who stimulates trade by pretending to buy something. A split, a detective. A flatty, a policeman. A diddy-decky, a gypsy. A Toby, a tramp. A drop, money given to a beggar. Funkum, lavender, or other perfume sold in envelopes. A boozer, a public house. A slang, a hawker's license. A kip, a place to sleep in or a night's lodging. Smoke, London. A Judy, a woman. The spike, the casual ward. The lump, the casual ward. A tosharoon, a half-crown. A diener, a shilling. A hog, a shilling. A sprousey, a sixpence. Clods, coppers. A drum, a billy can. Shackles, soup. A chat, a louse. Hard up, tobacco made from cigarette ends. A stick or cane, a burglar's jemmy. A peter, a safe. A bligh, a burglar's oxy-acetylene blow lamp. To bawl, to suck or swallow. To knock off, to steal. To skipper, to sleep in the open. About half of these words are in the larger dictionaries. It is interesting to guess at the derivation of some of them. The one or two, for instance, funkum and tosharoon, are beyond guessing. Diener presumably comes from denier. Glimmer, with the verb to glim, may have something to do with the old word glim, meaning a light, or another old word glim, meaning a glimpse. But it is an instance of the formation of new words. For its present sense, it can hardly be older than motor cars. G is a curious word. Conceivably, it has arisen out of G, meaning horse, in the sense of stalking horse. The derivation of scriver is mysterious. It must come ultimately from scribo. But there has been no similar word in English for the past 150 years. Nor can it have come directly from the French, for pavement artists are unknown in France. Judy and ball are East End words, not found west of Tower Bridge. Smoke is a word used only by tramps. Kip is Danish. Till quite recently, the word das was used in this sense, but it is now quite obsolete. London slang and dialect seem to change very rapidly. The old London accent, described by Dickens and Surtees, with V for W and W for V and so forth, has now vanished utterly. The Cockney accent, as we know, seems to have come up in the 40s. It is mentioned in an American book, Herman Melville's White Jacket, and Cockney is already changing. There are few people now who say face for face, noise for nice, and so forth as consistently as they did 20 years ago. The slang changes together with the accent. 25 or 30 years ago, for instance, the rhyming slang was all the rage in London. In the rhyming slang, everything was named by something rhyming with it. A hit or miss for a kiss, plates of meat for feet, etc. It was so common that it was even reproduced in novels. Now it is almost extinct. Perhaps all the words I have mentioned above will have vanished in another 20 years. Asterisk. It survives in certain abbreviations, such as use your twopenny or use your head. Twopenny is arrived at like this: head, loaf of bread, twopenny loaf, twopenny. The swear words also changed, or at any rate, they are subject to fashions. For example, 20 years ago, the London working classes habitually used the word bloody. Now they have abandoned it utterly, though novelists still represent them as using it. No born Londoner, it is different with people of Scotch or Irish origin, now says bloody unless he's a man of some education. The word has, in fact, moved up in the social scale and ceased to be a swear word for the purposes of the working classes. The current London adjective now tacked onto every noun is, no doubt in time, like bloody, will find its way into the drawing room and be replaced by some other word. The whole business of swearing, especially English swearing, is mysterious. Of its very nature, swearing is as irrational as magic. Indeed, it is a species of magic, but there is also a paradox about it, namely this: our intention in swearing is to shock and wound, which we do by mentioning something that should be kept secret, usually something to do with the sexual functions. But the strange thing is that when a word is well established as a swear word, it seems to lose its original meaning. That is, it loses the thing that made it into a swear word. A word becomes an oath because it means a certain thing. And because it has become an oath, it ceases to mean that thing. For example, the Londoners do not now use, or very seldom use, this word in its original meaning. It is on their lips from morning till night, but it is a mere expletive and means nothing. Similarly with, which is rapidly losing its original sense, one can think of similar instances in French, for example, which is now a quite meaningless expletive. The word also is still used occasionally in Paris, but the people who use it, or most of them, have no idea of what it once meant. The rule seems to be that words accepted as swear words have some magical character, which sets them apart and makes them useless for ordinary conversation. Words used as insults seem to be governed by the same paradox as swear words. A word becomes an insult, one would suppose, because it means something bad, but in practice, its insult value has little to do with its actual meaning. For example, the most bitter insult one can offer a Londoner is bastard, which, taken for what it means, is hardly an insult at all. And the worst insult to a woman, either in London or Paris, is cow, a name which might even be a compliment, for cows are among the most likable of animals. Evidently, a word is an insult simply because it is meant as an insult, without reference to its dictionary meaning. Words, especially swear words, being what public opinion chooses to make them. In this connection, it is interesting to see how a swear word can change character by crossing a frontier. In England, you can print Je m'en fous without protest from anybody. In France, you have to print it Je m'en fous. Or, as another example, take the word barn shoot, a corruption of the Hindustani word bahanshut, a vile and unforgivable insult in India. This word is a piece of gentle badinage in England. I have seen it in a school textbook. It is in one of Aristophanes' plays. And the annotator suggested it as rendering of some gibberish spoken by a Persian ambassador. Presumably, the annotator knew what bahanshut meant, but because it was a foreign word, it had lost its magical swear word quality and could be printed. One other thing is noticeable about swearing in London, and that is that the men do not usually swear in front of the women. In Paris, it is quite different. A Parisian workman may prefer to suppress an oath in front of a woman, but he is not at all scrupulous about it. And the women themselves swear freely. The Londoners are more polite or more squeamish in this matter. There are a few notes that I have set down, more or less at random. It is a pity that someone capable of dealing with the subject does not keep a yearbook of London slang and swearing, registering the changes accurately. It might throw useful light upon the formation, development, and obsolescence of words. Chapter 33. The £2 that B had given me lasted about 10 days. Then, that it lasted so long was due to Paddy, who would learn parsimony on the road and considered even one sound meal a day a wild extravagance. Food to him had come to mean simply bread and margarine, the eternal tea and 2 slices, which will cheat hunger for an hour or 2. He taught me how to live, food, bed, tobacco, and all, at the rate of ½ a crown a day, and he managed to earn a few extra shillings by glimming in the evenings. It was a precarious job, because illegal, but it brought in a little and eked out our money. One morning we tried for a job as sandwichmen. We went at 5 to an alleyway behind some offices, but There was already a queue of 30 or 40 men waiting, and after 2 hours we were told that there was no work for us. We had not missed much, for sandwich men have an unenviable job. They are paid about 3 shillings a day for 10 hours' work. It is hard work, especially in windy weather, and there is no skulking, for an inspector comes around frequently to see that the men are on their beat. To add to their troubles, they are only engaged by the day or sometimes for 3 days, never weekly, so that they have to wait hours for their job every morning. The number of unemployed men who are ready to do the work makes them powerless to fight for better treatment. The job all sandwich men covet is distributing handbills, which is paid for at the same rate. When you see a man distributing handbills, you can do him a good turn by taking one, for he goes off duty when he has distributed all his bills. Meanwhile, we went on with the lodging house life, a squalid, eventless life of crushing boredom. For days together there was nothing to do but sit in the underground kitchen, reading yesterday's newspaper, or, when one could get a hold of it, a back number of the Union Jack. It rained a great deal at this time, and everyone who came in steamed, so that the kitchen stank horribly. One's only excitement was the periodical Tea and 2 Slices. I do not know how many men are living this life in London. It must be thousands at least. As to Paddy, it was actually the best life he had known for 2 years past. His interludes from tramping, the times when he had somehow laid hands on a few shillings, had all been like this. The tramping itself had been slightly worse. Listening to his whimpering voice, he was always whimpering when he was not eating, one realized what torture unemployment must be to him. People are wrong when they think that an unemployed man only worries about losing his wages. On the contrary, an illiterate man with the work habit in his bones needs work, even more than he needs money. An educated man can put up with enforced idleness, which is one of the worst evils of poverty, but a man like Paddy, with no means of filling up time, is as miserable out of work as a dog on the chain. That is why it is such nonsense to pretend that those who have come down in the world are to be pitied above all others. The man who really merits pity is the man who has been down from the start and faces poverty with a blank, resourceless mind. It was a dull rhyme, and little of it stays in my mind, except for talks with Bozo. Once the lodging house was invaded by a slumming party. Paddy and I had been out, and coming back in the afternoon, we heard sounds of music downstairs. We went down to find 3 gentle people, sleekly dressed, holding a religious service in our kitchen. They were a grave and reverend signor in a frock coat, a lady sitting at a portable harmonium, and a chinless youth toying with a crucifix. It appeared that they had marched in and started to hold the service without any kind of invitation whatever. It was a pleasure to see how the lodgers met this intrusion. They did not offer the smallest rudeness to the slummers. They just ignored them. By common consent, everyone in the kitchen, 100 men perhaps, behaved as though the slummers had not existed. There they stood, patiently singing and exhorting, and no more notice was taken of them than if they had been earwigs. The gentleman in the frock coat preached a sermon, but not a word of it was audible. It was drowned in the usual din of songs, oaths, and the clattering of pans. Men sat at their meals and card games 3 feet away from the harmonium, peaceably ignoring it. Presently the slummers gave it up and cleared out, not insulted in any way, but merely disregarded. No doubt they consoled themselves by thinking how brave they had been, freely venturing into the lowest dens, etc., etc. Bozo said that these people came to the lodging house several times a month. They had influence with the police, and the deputy could not exclude them. It is curious how people take it for granted that they have a right to preach at you and pray over you as soon as your income falls below a certain level. After 9 days, B's £2 was reduced to 1 and 9 pence. Paddy and I set aside 18 pence for our beds and spent 3 pence on the usual tea and 2 slices which we shared, an appetizer rather than a meal. By the afternoon, we were damnably hungry. And Paddy remembered a church near King's Cross Station where free tea was given once a week to tramps. This was the day, and we decided to go there. Bozo, though it was rainy weather and he was almost penniless, would not come, saying that churches were not his style. Outside the church, quite 100 men were waiting, dirty types who had gathered from far and wide at the news of a free tea, like kites round a dead buffalo. Presently, the doors opened, and a clergyman and some girls shepherded us into a gallery at the top of the church. It was an evangelical church, gaunt and wilfully ugly, with texts about blood and fire blazoned on the walls, and a hymn book containing 1,251 hymns. Reading some of the hymns, I concluded that the book would do as it stood for an anthology of bad verse. There was to be a service after the tea, and the regular congregation were sitting in the well of the church below. It was a weekday, and there were only a few dozen of them, mostly stringy old women who reminded one of boiling fowls. We ranged ourselves in the gallery pews and were given our tea. It was 1 pound jam jar of tea with 6 slices of bread and margarine. As soon as tea was over, a dozen tramps who had stationed themselves near the door bolted to avoid the service. The rest stayed, less from gratitude than lacking the cheek to go. The organ let out a few preliminary hoots, and the service began. And instantly, as though at a signal, the tramps began to misbehave in the most outrageous way. One would not have thought such scenes possible in a church. All round the gallery, men lolled in their pews, laughed, chattered, leaned over, and flicked pellets of bread among the congregation. I had to restrain the man next to me, more or less by force, from lighting a cigarette. The tramps treated the service as a purely comic spectacle. It was indeed a sufficiently ludicrous service, the kind where there are sudden yells of hallelujah and endless extempore prayers, but their behavior passed all bounds. There was one old fellow in the congregation, Brother Boodle or some such name, who was often called on to lead us in prayer, and whenever he stood up, the tramps would begin stamping as though in a theatre. They said that on a previous occasion he had kept up an extempore prayer for 25 minutes, until the minister had interrupted him. Once, when Brother Boodle stood up, a tramp called out, "Do the one he don't beat 7 minutes," so loud that the whole church must hear. It was not long before we were making far more noise than the minister. Sometimes someone below would send up an indignant "hush," but it made no impression. We had set ourselves to guide the service, and there was no stopping us. It was a queer, rather disgusting scene. Below were the handful of simple, well-meaning people trying hard to worship, and above were the 100 men whom they had fed, deliberately making worship impossible. A ring of dirty, hairy faces grinned down from the gallery, openly jeering. What could a few women and old men do against 100 hostile tramps? They were afraid of us, and we were frankly bullying them. It was our revenge upon them for having humiliated us by feeding us. The minister was a brave man. He thundered steadily through a long sermon on Joshua, and managed almost to ignore the sniggers and chattering from above. But in the end, perhaps goaded beyond endurance, he announced loudly, "I shall address the last 5 minutes of my sermon to the unsaved sinners." Having said which, he turned his face to the gallery and kept it so for 5 minutes, lest there should be any doubt about who were saved and who were unsaved. But much we cared. Even while the minister was threatening hellfire, we were rolling cigarettes, and at the last amen, we clattered down the stairs with a yell, many agreeing to come back for another free tea next week. The scene had interested me. It was so different from the ordinary demeanor of tramps, from the abject, worm-like gratitude with which they normally accept charity. The explanation, of course, was that we outnumbered the congregation, and so were not afraid of them. A man receiving charity practically always hates his benefactor. It is a fixed characteristic of human nature, and when he has 50 or 100 others to back him, he will show it. In the evening, after the free tea, Paddy unexpectedly earned another 18 pence at glimming. It was exactly enough for another night's lodging, and we put it aside and went hungry till 9 the next evening. Bozo, who might have given us some food, was away all day. The pavements were wet, and he had gone to the Elephant and Castle, where he knew of a pitch under shelter. Luckily, I still had some tobacco, so that the day might have been worse. At 8:30, Paddy took me to the Embankment, where a clergyman was known to distribute meal tickets once a week. On the Charing Cross Bridge, 50 men were waiting, mirrored in the shivering puddles. Some of them were truly appalling specimens. They were embankment sleepers, and the embankment dredges up worse types than the Spike. One of them, I remember, was dressed in an overcoat without buttons, laced up with rope, a pair of ragged trousers, and boots exposing his toes. Not a rag else. He was bearded like a fakir, and he had managed to streak his chest and shoulders with some horrible black filth, resembling train oil. What one could see of his face under the dirt and hair was bleached white as paper by some malignant disease. I heard him speak, and he had a goodish accent, as of a clerk or shop walker. Presently the clergyman appeared, and the men ranged themselves in a queue, in the order in which they had arrived. The clergyman was a nice, chubby, youngish man, and curiously enough, very like Charlie, my friend in Paris. He was shy and embarrassed, and did not speak except for a brief good evening. He simply hurried down the line of men, thrusting a ticket upon each, and not waiting to be thanked. The consequence was that, for once, there was some genuine gratitude, and everyone said that the clergyman was a good fellow. Someone, in his hearing, I believe, called out, "Well, he'll never be a bishop." This, of course, intended as a warm compliment. The tickets were worth 6 pence each, and were directed to an eating-house not far away. When we got there, we found that the proprietor, knowing that the tramps could not go elsewhere, was cheating by only giving 4 pennyworth of food for each ticket. Paddy and I pooled our tickets and received food which we could have got for 7 pence or 8 pence at most coffee shops. The clergyman had distributed well over £1 in tickets, so that the proprietor was evidently swindling the tramps in the tune of 7 shillings or more a week. This kind of victimization is a regular part of a tramp's life, and it will go on as long as people continue to give meal tickets instead of money. Paddy and I went back to the lodging-house, and, still hungry, loafed in the kitchen, making the warmth of the fire a substitute for food. At 10:30, Bozo arrived, tired and haggard, for his mangled leg made walking an agony. He had not earned a penny at screeving. All the pitches under shelter being taken, and for several hours he had begged outright, with one eye on the policeman. He had amassed 8 pence, a penny short of his kip. It was long past the hour for paying, and he had only managed to slip indoors when the deputy was not looking. At any moment he might be caught and turned out to sleep on the embankment. Bozo took the things out of his pockets and looked them over, debating what to sell. He decided on his razor, took it round the kitchen, and in a few minutes he had sold it for 3 pence, enough to pay for his kip, buy a basin of tea, and leave a halfpenny over. Bozo got his basin of tea and sat down by the fire to dry his clothes. As he drank the tea, I saw that he was laughing to himself, as though at some good joke. Surprised, I asked him what he had to laugh at. "It's bloody funny," he said. "It's funny enough a bunch. What do you think I've been and done?" "What?" "Sold my razor without having a shave first of all, the fools." He had not eaten since the morning, had walked several miles with a twisted leg, his clothes were drenched, and he had a halfpenny between himself and starvation. With all this, he could laugh over the loss of his razor. One could not help admiring him. Chapter 34. The next morning, our money being at an end, Paddy and I set out for the Spike. We went southward by the old Kent road, making for Cromley. We could not go to a London Spike, for Paddy had been in one recently and did not care to risk going again. It was a 16-mile walk over asphalt, blistering to the heels, and we were acutely hungry. Paddy browsed the pavement, laying up a store of cigarette ends against his time in the Spike. In the end, his perseverance was rewarded, for he picked up a penny. We bought a large piece of stale bread and devoured it as we walked. When we got to Cromley, it was too early to go to the Spike, and we walked several miles farther to a plantation beside a meadow where one could sit down. It was a regular caravanserai of tramps. One could tell it by the worn grass and the sodden newspaper and rusty cans that they had left behind. Other tramps were arriving by ones and twos. It was jolly autumn weather. Nearby, a deep bed of pansies was growing. It seemed to me that even now I can smell the sharp reek of those pansies, warring with the reek of tramps. In the meadow, 2 cart-horse colts, raw sienna color, with white manes and tails, were nibbling at a gate. We sprawled about on the ground, sweaty and exhausted. Someone managed to find dry sticks and get a fire going. We all had milkless tea out of a tin drum, which was passed around. Some of the tramps began telling stories. One of them, Bill, was an interesting type, a genuine sturdy beggar of the old breed, strong as Hercules and a frank foe of work. He boasted that with his great strength, he could get a navvying job any time he liked. But as soon as he drew his first week's wages, he went on a terrific drunk and was sacked. Between whiles, he mooched, chiefly from shopkeepers. He talked like this. I ain't going far in Kent. Kent's a tight country. Kent is. There's too many been mooching about here. The bakers get so as they throw their bread away sooner they give it to you. Now, Oxford, that's the place for mooching, Oxford is. When I was in Oxford, I mooched bread, and I mooched bacon, and I mooched beef, and every night I mooched tanners for my keep off of the students. The last night I was 2 pence short of my keep, so I goes up to a parson and mooches him for 3 pence. He give me 3 pence, and the next moment he turns around and gives me in charge for begging. You been begging, the copper says. No, I ain't, I says. I was asking the gentleman the time, I says. The copper starts feeling inside my coat, and he pulls out a pound of meat and 2 loaves of bread. Well, what's all this then? He says. You better come along to the station, he says. The beak give me 7 days. I don't mooch from no more parsons. But Christ, what do I care for a layup of 7 days? Etc., etc. It seems that his whole life was this, a round of mooching, drunks, and layups. He laughed as he talked of it, taking it all for a tremendous joke. He looked as though he made a poor thing out of begging, for he wore only a corduroy suit, scarf, and cap, no socks or linen. Still, he was fat and jolly, and he even smelt of beer, a most unusual smell in a tramp nowadays. 2 of the tramps had been in Cromley Spike recently, and they told a ghost story connected with it. Years earlier, they said, there had been a suicide there. A tramp had managed to smuggle a razor into his cell and there cut his throat. In the morning, when the tramp major came around, the body was jammed against the door, and to open it they had to break the dead man's arm. In revenge for this, The dead man haunted his cell, and anyone who slept there was certain to die within the year. There were copious instances, of course. If a cell door stuck, when you tried to open it, you should avoid that cell like the plague, for it was the haunted one. Two tramps, ex-sailors, told another grisly tale. A man, they swore they had known him, had planned to stow away on a boat bound for Chile. It was laden with manufactured goods, packed in big wooden crates, and with the help of a docker, the stowaway had managed to hide himself in one of these. But the docker had made a mistake about the order in which the crates were to be loaded. The crane gripped the stowaway, swung him aloft, and deposited him at the very bottom of the hold, beneath hundreds of crates. No one discovered what had happened until the end of the voyage, when they found the stowaway rotting, dead of suffocation. Another tramp told the story of Gilderoy, the Scottish robber. Gilderoy was the man who was condemned to be hanged, escaped, captured the judge who had sentenced him, and, splendid fellow, hanged him. The tramps liked the story, of course, but the interesting thing was they had got it all wrong. Their version was that Gilderoy escaped to America, whereas in reality, he was recaptured and put to death. The story had been amended, no doubt, deliberately, just as children amend the stories of Samson and Robin Hood, giving them happy endings which are quite imaginary. This set the tramps talking about history, and a very old man declared that the one-bite law was a survival from days when the nobles hunted men instead of deer. Some of the others laughed at him, but he had the idea firm in his head. He had heard, too, of the Corn Laws, and the Jus Primae Noctis. He believed it had really existed. Also of the Great Rebellion, which he thought was a rebellion of poor against rich. Perhaps he had got it mixed up with the peasant rebellions. I doubt whether the old man could read, and certainly he was not repeating newspaper articles. His scraps of history had been passed from generation to generation of tramps, perhaps for centuries in some cases. It was oral tradition lingering on, like a faint echo from the Middle Ages. Patty and I went to the Spike at 6 p.m, getting out at 10 a.m. It was much like Rompton and Edbury, and we saw nothing of the ghost. Among the casuals were two young men named William and Fred, ex-fishermen from Norfolk. A lively pair and fond of singing. They had a song called Unhappy Bella. That is worth writing down. I heard them sing it 6 times during the next 2 days, and I managed to get it by heart, except a line or two which I have guessed. It ran, Bella was young and Bella was fair, with bright blue eyes and golden hair. Oh, unhappy Bella! Her step was light and her heart was gay. She had no sense, and one fine day she got herself put in the family way by a wicked, heartless, cruel deceiver. Poor Bella was young. She didn't believe that the world is hard and men deceive. Oh, unhappy Bella! She said, my man will do what's just. He'll marry me now because he must. Her heart was full of loving trust in a wicked, heartless, cruel deceiver. She went to his house, that dirty skunk had packed his bags and done a bunk. Oh, unhappy Bella! Her landlady said, get out, you whore, I won't have you sort of darkening my door. Poor Bella was put to affliction sore by a wicked, heartless, cruel deceiver. All night she tramped the cruel snows. What she must have suffered, nobody knows. Oh, unhappy Bella! And when the morning dawned so red, alas, alas, poor Bella was dead, sent so young to her lonely bed by a wicked, heartless, cruel deceiver. So thus, you see, do what you will, the fruits of sin are suffering still. Oh, unhappy Bella! As into the grave they laid her low, the men said, alas, but life is so. But the women chanted sweet and low, it's all the men, the dirty bastards. Written by a woman, perhaps. William and Fred, the singers of this song, were thorough scallywags, the sort of men who get tramps a bad name. They happened to know that the tramp major at Crumley had a stock of old clothes which were to be given at need to casuals. Before going in, William and Fred took off their boots, ripped the seams, and cut pieces off the soles, more or less ruining them. Then they applied for 2 pair of boots, and the tramp major, seeing how bad their boots were, gave them almost new pairs. William and Fred were scarcely outside the Spike in the morning before they had sold these boots for 1 and 9 pence. It seemed to them quite worthwhile, for 1 and 9 pence, to make their own boots practically unwearable. Leaving the Spike, we all started southward, a long, slouching procession, for Lower Binfield and Ide Hill. On the way there was a fight between 2 of the tramps. They had quarrelled overnight. There was some silly casus belli about one saying to the other, "Bullshit," which was taken for Bolshevik, a deadly insult. And they fought it out in a field. A dozen of us stayed to watch them. The scene sticks in my mind for one thing: the man who was beaten going down and his cap falling off and showing that his hair was quite white. After that, some of us intervened and stopped the fight. Paddy had meanwhile been making inquiries, and found that the real cause of the quarrel was, as usual, a few pennyworth of food. We got to Lower Binfield quite early, and Paddy filled in the time by asking for work at back doors. At one house, he was given some boxes to chop up for firewood, and saying he had a maid outside, he brought me in, and we did the work together. When it was done, the householder told the maid to take us out a cup of tea. I remember the terrified way in which she brought it out, and then, losing her courage, set the cups down on the path and bolted back to the house, shutting herself in the kitchen. So dreadful is the name of tramp. They paid us 6 pence each, and we bought a 3-penny loaf and half an ounce of tobacco, leaving 5 pence. Paddy thought it wiser to bury our 5 pence, for the tramp major at Lower Binfield was renowned as a tyrant and might refuse to admit us if we had any money at all. It is quite a common practice of tramps to bury their money. If they intend to smuggle at all a large sum into the Spike, they generally sew it into their clothes, which may mean prison if they are caught, of course. Paddy and Bozo used to tell a good story about this. An Irishman. Bozo said it was an Irishman. Paddy said it was an Englishman, not a tramp, and in possession of £30, was stranded in a small village where he could not get a bed. He consulted a tramp who advised him to go to the workhouse. It is quite a regular proceeding, if one cannot get a bed elsewhere, to get one at a workhouse, paying a reasonable sum for it. The Irishman, however, thought he would be clever and get a bed for nothing. So he presented himself at the workhouse as an ordinary casual. He had sewn the £30 into his clothes. Meanwhile, the tramp who had advised him had seen his chance, and that night he privately asked the tramp major for permission to leave the Spike early in the morning, as he had to see about a job. At 6 in the morning he was released and went out in the Irishman's clothes. The Irishman complained of the theft and was given 30 days for going into a casual ward under false pretenses. Chapter 35. Arrived at Lower Binfield, we sprawled for a long time on the green, watching the cottagers from their front gates. A clergyman and his daughter came and stared silently at us for a while, as though we had been aquarium fishes, and then went away again. There were several dozen of us waiting. William and Fred were there, still singing, and the men who had fought, and Bill, the moocher. He had been mooching from bakers and had quantities of stale bread tucked away between his coat and his bare body. He shared it out, and we were all glad of it. There was a woman among us, the first woman tramp I had ever seen. She was fattish, battered, very dirty woman of 60, in a long trailing black skirt. She put on great airs of dignity, and if anyone sat down near her, she sniffed and moved farther off. "Where you bound for, missus?" one of the tramps called to her. The woman sniffed and looked into the distance. "Come on, missus," he said. "Cheer up, be chummy. We're all in the same boat here." "Thank you," said the woman bitterly. "When I want to get mixed up with a set of tramps, I'll let you know." I enjoyed the way she said tramps. It seemed to show you in a flash the whole other soul, a small, blinkered, feminine soul that had learned absolutely nothing from years on the road. She was no doubt a respectable widow woman, become a tramp through some grotesque accident. The Spike opened at 6. This was Saturday, and we were to be confined over the weekend, which is the usual practice. Why, I do not know, unless it is from a vague feeling that Sunday merits something disagreeable. When we registered, I gave my trade as journalist. It was truer than painter, for I had sometimes earned money from newspaper articles, but it was a silly thing to say, being bound to lead to questions. As soon as we were inside the Spike and had been lined up for the search, the tramp major called my name. He was a stiff, soldierly man of 40, not looking the bully he had been presented, but with an old soldier's gruffness. He said sharply, "Which of you is blank?" I forgot what name I had given. "Me, sir." "So, you're a journalist?" "Yes, sir," I said, quaking. A few questions would betray the fact that I had been lying, which might mean prison. But the tramp major only looked me up and down and said, "Then you're a gentleman." "I suppose so." He gave me another long look. "Well, that's bloody bad luck, governor," he said. "Bloody bad luck, that is." And thereafter he treated me with unfair favoritism, and even with a kind of deference. He did not search me, and in the bathroom he actually gave me a clean towel to myself, an unheard of luxury. So powerful is the word gentleman in an old soldier's ear. By 7, we had wolfed our bread and tea and were in our cells. We slept one in a cell, and there were bedsteads and straw palliases, so that one ought to have had a good night's sleep, but no Spike is perfect. And the peculiar shortcoming of Lower Binfield was the cold. The hot pipes were not working, and the 2 blankets we had been given were thin cotton things and almost useless. It was only autumn, but the cold was bitter. We spent the long 12-hour night in turning from side to side, falling asleep for a few minutes and waking up shivering. We could not smoke, for our tobacco, which we had managed to smuggle in, was in our clothes, and we should not get these back till the morning. All down the passage one could hear groaning noises, and sometimes a shouted oath. No one, I imagine, had gotten more than an hour or 2 of sleep. In the morning, after breakfast and the doctor's inspection, the tramp major herded us all into the dining room and locked the door upon us. It was a lime-washed, stone-floored room, unutterably dreary, with its furniture of deal boards and benches, and its prison smell. The barred windows were too high to look out of, and there were no ornaments save a clock and a copy of the workhouse rules. Packed elbow to elbow on the benches, we were bored already, though it was barely 8 in the morning. There was nothing to do, nothing to talk about, not even room to move. The sole consolation was that one could smoke, for smoking was connived at so long as one was not caught in the act. Scotty, a little hairy tramp with a bastard accent sired by Cockney out of Glasgow, was tobaccoless, his tin of cigarette ends having fallen out of his boot during the search and been impounded. I stood him the makings of a cigarette. We smoked furtively, thrusting our cigarettes into our pockets like schoolboys, when we heard the tramp major coming. Most of the tramps spent 10 continuous hours in this comfortless, soulless room. Heaven knows how they put up with it. I was luckier than the others, for at 10 o'clock the tramp major told off a few men for odd jobs, and he picked me out to help in the workhouse kitchen, the most coveted job of all. This, like the clean towel, was a charm worked by the word gentleman. There was no work to do in the kitchen, and I sneaked off into a small shed used for storing potatoes, where some workhouse paupers were skulking to avoid the Sunday morning service. There were comfortable packing cases to sit on, and some back numbers of the Family Herald, and even a copy of Raffles from the workhouse library. The paupers talked interestingly about workhouse life. They told me, among other things, that the thing really hated in the workhouse, as a stigma of charity, is the uniform. If the men could wear their own clothes, or even their own caps and scarves, they would not mind being paupers. I had my dinner from the workhouse table, and it was a meal fit for a boa constrictor, the largest meal I had eaten since my first day at the Hotel X. The paupers said that they habitually gorged to the bursting point on Sunday, and were underfed the rest of the week. After dinner, the cook sent me to do the washing up, and told me to throw away the food that remained. The wastage was astonishing, and in the circumstances, appalling. Half-eaten joints of meat and bucketfuls of broken bread and vegetables were pitched away like so much rubbish, and then defiled with tea leaves. I filled 5 dustbins to overflowing with quite eatable food. And while I did so, 50 tramps were sitting in the spike, with their bellies half filled by the spike dinner of bread and cheese, and perhaps 2 cold-boiled potatoes each, in honor of Sunday. According to the paupers, the food was thrown away from deliberate policy, rather than it should be given to the tramps. At 3, I went back to the spike. The tramps had been sitting there since 8, with hardly room to move an elbow, and now they were half mad with boredom. Even smoking was at an end, for a tramp's tobacco is picked up cigarette ends, and he starves if he is more than a few hours away from the pavement. Most of the men were too bored even to talk. They had just packed on the benches, staring at nothing, their scrubby faces split in 2 by enormous yawns. The room stank of ennui. Paddy, his backside aching from the hard bench, was in a whimpering mood, and to pass the time away I talked with a rather superior tramp, a young carpenter, who wore a collar and tie and was on the road, he said, for lack of a set of tools. He kept a little aloof from the other tramps and held himself more like a free man than a casual. He had literary taste, too, and carried a copy of Quentin Durward in his pocket. He told me that he never went into a spike unless driven there by hunger, sleeping under hedges and behind ricks in preference. Along the south coast he had begged by day and slept in bathing huts for weeks at a time. We talked of life on the road. He criticized the system that makes a tramp spend 14 hours a day in the spike and the other 10 in walking and dodging the police. He spoke of his own case, 6 months, at the public charge for want of a few pounds worth of tools. It was idiotic, he said. Then I told him about the wastage of food in the workhouse kitchen and what I thought of it. And at that, he changed his tone instantly. I saw that I had awakened the pew renter who sleeps in every English workman. Though he had been famished along with the others, he at once saw reasons why the food should have been thrown away rather than given to the tramps. He admonished me quite severely. "They have to do it," he said. "If they made these places too comfortable, you'd have all the scum of the country flocking into them. It's only the bad food as keeps them all that scum away. These here tramps are too lazy to work, that's all that's wrong with them. You don't want to go encouraging of them. They're scum." I produced arguments to prove him wrong, but he would not listen. He kept repeating, "You don't want to have any pity on these here tramps. Scum they are. You don't want to judge them by the same standards as men like you and me. They're scum, just scum." It was interesting to see the subtle way in which he disassociated himself from these here tramps. He had been on the road 6 months, but in the sight of God, he seemed to imply he was not a tramp. I imagine there was quite a lot of tramps who thank God they are not tramps. They are like the trippers who say such cutting things about trippers. 3 hours dragged by. At 6, supper arrived and turned out to be quite uneatable. The bread, tough enough in the morning, it had been cut into slices on Saturday night, was now as hard as ship's biscuit. Luckily, it was spread with dripping, and we scraped the dripping off and ate that alone, which was better than nothing. At 6:15, we were sent to bed. New tramps were arriving, and in order not to mix the tramps of different days, for fear of infectious diseases, the new men were put in the cells and we in dormitories. Our dormitory was a barn-like room with 30 beds close together, and a tub to serve as a common chamber pot. It stank abominably, and the older men coughed and got up all night. But, being so many together, kept the room warm, and we had some sleep. We dispersed at 10 in the morning after a fresh medical inspection, with a hunk of bread and cheese for our midday dinner. William and Fred, strong in the possession of a shilling, impaled their bread on the spike railings as a protest, they said. This was the second spike in Kent they had been made too hot to hold them, and they thought it a great joke. They were cheerful souls for tramps. The imbecile, there's an imbecile in every collection of tramps, said that he was too tired to walk and clung to the railings, until the tramp major had to dislodge him and start him with a kick. Paddy and I turned north for London. Most of the others were going on to Ide Hill, said to be about the worst spike in England. I have been in it since, and it is not so bad. Once again, it was jolly autumn weather, and the road was quiet, with few cars passing. The air was like sweet briar after the spike's mingled stenches of sweat, soap, and drains. We two seemed the only tramps on the road. Then I heard a hurried step behind us, and someone calling. It was little Scotty, the Glasgow tramp, who had run after us panting. He produced a rusty tin from his pocket. He wore a friendly smile, like someone repaying an obligation. "Here you are, mate," he said cordially. "I owe you some fag ends. You stood me a smoke yesterday. The tramp major give me back my box of fag ends when we came out this morning. One good turn deserves another. Here you are." And he put 4 soddened about loathly cigarette ends into my hand. Chapter 36. I want to set down some general remarks about tramps. When one comes to think of it, tramps are a queer product and worth thinking over. It is queer that a tribe of men, tens of thousands in number, should be marching up and down England like so many wandering Jews. But though the case obviously wants considering, one cannot even start to consider it until one has got rid of certain prejudices. These prejudices are rooted in the idea that every tramp, ipso facto, is a blackguard. In childhood, we've been taught that tramps are blackguards, and consequently, there exists in our minds a sort of ideal or typical tramp, a repulsive, rather dangerous creature who would die rather than work or wash, and wants nothing but to beg, drink, and rob hen houses. This tramp monster is no truer to life than the sinister Chinaman of the magazine stories. But he is very hard to get rid of. The very word tramp evokes his image, and the belief in him obscures the real questions of vagrancy. To take a fundamental question about vagrancy, why do tramps exist at all? It is a curious thing, but very few people know what makes a tramp take to the road. And because of the belief in the tramp monster, the most fantastic reasons are suggested. It is said, for instance, that tramps tramp to avoid work, to beg more easily, to seek opportunities for crime, even, least probable of reasons, because they like tramping. I have even read in a book of criminology that the tramp is an atavism, a throwback to the nomadic stage of humanity. And meanwhile, the quite obvious cause of vagrancy is staring one in the face. Of course, a tramp is not a nomadic atavism. One might as well say that a commercial traveler is an atavism. A tramp tramps not because he likes it, but for the same reason as a car keeps to the left, because there happens to be a law compelling him to do so. A destitute man, if he is not supported by the parish, can only get relief at the casual wards, and as each casual ward will only admit him for one night, he is automatically kept moving. He is a vagrant because in the state of the law, it is that or starve. But people have been brought up to believe in the tramp monster, and so they prefer to think that there must be some more or less villainous motive for tramping. As a matter of fact, very little of the tramp monster will survive inquiry. Take the generally accepted idea that tramps are dangerous characters. Quite apart from experience, one can say a priori that very few tramps are dangerous, because if they were dangerous, they would be treated accordingly. A casual ward will often admit 100 tramps in one night, and these are handled by a staff of at most 3 porters. 100 ruffians could not be controlled by 3 unarmed men. Indeed, when one sees how tramps let themselves be bullied by the workhouse officials, it is obvious that they are the most docile, broken-spirited creatures imaginable. Or take the idea that all tramps are drunkards, an idea ridiculous on the face of it. No doubt many tramps would drink if they got the chance, but in the nature of things, they cannot get the chance. At this moment, a pale watery stuff called beer is 7 pence a pint in England. To be drunk on it would cost at least half a crown, and a man who can command half a crown at all often is not a tramp. The idea that tramps are impudent social parasites, sturdy beggars, is not absolutely unfounded, but it is only true in a few % of the cases. Deliberate, cynical parasitism, such as one reads of in Jack London's books on American tramping, is not in the English character. The English are a conscience-ridden race, with a strong sense of the sinfulness of poverty. One cannot imagine the average Englishman deliberately turning parasite, and this national character does not necessarily change because a man is thrown out of work. Indeed, if one remembers that a tramp is only an Englishman out of work, forced by law to live as a vagabond, then the tramp monster vanishes. Now, I am not saying, of course, that most tramps are ideal characters. I am only saying that they are ordinary human beings, and that if they are worse than other people, it is the result and not the cause of their way of life. It follows that the serve 'em damn well right attitude that is normally taken towards tramps is no fairer than it would be towards cripples or invalids. When one has realized that, one begins to put oneself in a tramp's place and understands what his life is like. It is an extraordinarily futile, acutely unpleasant life. I have described the casual ward, the routine of a tramp's day. But there are 3 especial evils that need insisting upon. The first is hunger, which is the almost general fate of tramps. The casual ward gives them a ration which is probably not even meant to be sufficient, and anything beyond this must be got by begging, that is, by breaking the law. The result is that nearly every tramp is rotted by malnutrition, for proof of which one need only look at the men lining up outside any casual ward. The second great evil of a tramp's life, it seems much smaller at first sight, but it is a good second, is that he is entirely cut off from contact with women. This point needs elaborating. Tramps are cut off from women in the first place because there are very few women at their level of society. One might imagine that among destitute people, the sexes would be equally balanced as elsewhere, but it is not so. In fact, one can almost say that below a certain level of society is entirely male. The following figures, published by LCC, from a night census taken on February 13th, 1931, will show the relative numbers of destitute men and destitute women. Spending the night in the streets, 60 men, 18 women. This must be an underestimate, still the proportions probably hold good. In shelters and homes not licensed as common lodging houses, 1,057 men, 137 women. In the crypt of St. Martin's in the Fields Church, 88 men, 12 women. In LCC casual wards and hostels, 674 men, 15 women. It will be seen from these figures that at the charity level, men outnumber women by something like 10 to 1. The cause is presumably that unemployment affects women less than men, also that any presentable woman can, in the last resort, attach herself to some man. The result for a tramp is that he is condemned to perpetual celibacy. For of course it goes without saying that if a tramp finds no women at his own level, those above, even a very little above, are as far out of his reach as the moon. The reasons are not worth discussing, but there is no doubt that women never, or hardly ever, condescend to men who are much poorer than themselves. A tramp, therefore, is a celibate from the moment when he takes to the road. He is absolutely without hope of getting a wife, a mistress, or any kind of woman, except, very rarely, when he can raise a few shillings, a prostitute. It is obvious that the results of this must be homosexuality, for instance, and occasional rape cases, but deeper than these, there is the degradation worked in a man who knows that he is not even considered fit for marriage. The sexual impulse, not to put it any higher, is a fundamental impulse, and starvation of it can be almost as demoralizing as physical hunger. The evil of poverty is not so much that it makes a man suffer, as that it rots him physically and spiritually. And there can be no doubt that sexual starvation contributes to this rotting process. Cut off from the whole race of women, a tramp feels himself degraded to the rank of a cripple or a lunatic. No humiliation could do more damage to a man's self-respect. The other great evil of a tramp's life is enforced idleness. By our vagrancy laws, things are so arranged that when he is not walking the road, he is sitting in a cell, or, in the intervals, lying on the ground waiting for the casual ward to open. It is obvious that this is a dismal, demoralizing life, especially for an uneducated man. Beside these, one could enumerate scores of minor evils. To name only one, discomfort, which is inseparable from life on the road. It is worth remembering that the average tramp has no clothes but what he stands up in, wears boots that are ill-fitting, and does not sit in a chair for months together. But the important point is that a tramp's sufferings are entirely useless. He lives a fantastically disagreeable life, and lives it to no purpose whatever. One could not, in fact, invent a more futile routine than walking from prison to prison, spending perhaps 18 hours a day in the cell and on the road. There must be at least several tens of thousands of tramps in England. Each day they expend innumerable foot-pounds of energy, enough to plow thousands of acres, build miles of road, put up dozens of houses, in mere useless walking. Each day they waste between them possibly 10 years of time in staring at cell walls. They cost the country at least £1 a week a man and give nothing in return for it. They go round and round on an endless boring game of general post, which is of no use and is not even meant to be of any use to anyone whatsoever. This law keeps this process going, and we have got so accustomed to it that we are not surprised. But it is very silly. Granting the futility of a tramp's life, the question is whether anything could be done to improve it. Obviously, it would be possible, for instance, to make the casual wards a little more habitable, and this is actually being done in some cases. During the last year, some of the casual wards have been improved beyond recognition, if the accounts are true. But there is talk of doing the same to all of them. This does not go to the heart of the problem. The problem is how to turn the tramp from a bored, half-alive vagrant into a self-respecting human being. A mere increase of comfort cannot do this. Even if the casual wards became positively luxurious, they never will, a tramp's life would still be wasted. He would still be a pauper, cut off from marriage and home life, and a dead loss to the community. What is needed is to depauperize him, and this can only be done by finding him work. Not work for the sake of working, but work of which he can enjoy the benefit. At present, in the great majority of casual wards, tramps do no work whatever. At one time, they were made to break stones for their food, but this was stopped when they had broken enough stone for years ahead and put the stone breakers out of work. Nowadays, they are kept idle because there's seemingly nothing for them to do. Yet there's a fairly obvious way of making them useful, namely this. Each workhouse could run a small farm, or at least a kitchen garden, and every able-bodied tramp who presented himself could be made to do a sound day's work. The produce of the farm or garden could be used for feeding the tramps, and at the worst, it would be better than the filthy diet of bread and margarine and tea. Of course, the casual wards could never be quite self-supporting, but they could go a long way towards it, and the rates would probably benefit in the long run. It must be remembered that under the present system, tramps are as dead a loss to the country as they could possibly be, for they do not only do no work, but they live on a diet that is bound to undermine their health. The system therefore loses lives as well as money. A scheme which fed them decently and made them produce at least a part of their own food would be worth trying. In fairness, it must be added that a few of the casual wards have been improved recently, at least from the point of view of sleeping accommodation, but most of them are the same as ever, and there has been no real improvement in the food. It may be objected that a farm or even a garden could not be run with casual labor, but there is no real reason why tramps should only stay a day at each casual ward. They might stay a month or even a year, if there were work for them to do. The constant circulation of tramps is something quite artificial. At present, a tramp is an expense to the rates, and the object of each workhouse is therefore to push him on to the next. Hence, the rule that he can only stay one night. If he returns within a month, he's penalized by being confined for a week, and as this is much the same as being in prison, naturally he keeps moving. But if he represented labor to the workhouse, and the workhouse represented sound food to him, it would be another matter. The workhouses would develop into partially self-supporting institutions, and the tramps, settling down here or there according as they needed, would cease to be tramps. They would be doing something comparatively useful, getting decent food, and living a settled life. By degrees, if the scheme worked well, they might even cease to be regarded as paupers, and be able to marry and take a respectable place in society. This is only a rough idea, and there are some obvious objections to it. Nevertheless, it does suggest a way of improving the status of tramps, without piling new burdens on the rates. And the solution must in any case be something of this kind. For the question is, what to do with men who are underfed and idle? And the answer, to make them grow their own food, imposes itself automatically. Chapter 37. A word about the sleeping accommodation open to a homeless person in London. At present, it is impossible to get a bed in any non-charitable institution in London for less than 7 pence a night. If you cannot afford 7 pence for a bed, you must put up with one of the following substitutes. 1. The embankment. Here is the account that Paddy gave me of sleeping on the embankment. The whole thing with the embankment is getting to sleep early. You got to be on your bench by 8 o'clock, because there ain't too many benches, and sometimes they're all taken. And you got to try to get to sleep at once. 'Tis too cold to sleep much after 12 o'clock, and the police turns you off at 4 in the morning. It ain't easy to sleep, though, with them bloody
Trams flying past your head all the time, and them sky signs across the river flicking on and off in your eyes. The cold's cruel. Them as sleeps there generally wraps themselves up in newspapers, but it don't do much good. You'd be bloody lucky if you got 3 hours sleep.
I have slept on the embankment and found that it corresponded to Paddy's description. It is, however, much better than not sleeping at all, which is the alternative if you spend the night in the streets elsewhere than on the embankment. According to the law in London, you may sit down for the night, but the police must move you on if they see you asleep. The embankment, and 1 or 2 odd corners, there is one behind the Lyceum Theatre, are special exceptions. This law is evidently a piece of willful offensiveness. Its object, so it is said, is to prevent people from dying of exposure, but clearly, if a man has no home and is going to die of exposure, die he will, asleep or awake. In Paris, there is no such law. There people sleep by the score under the Seine bridges and in doorways and on benches in the squares, round the ventilating shafts of the metro and even inside the metro stations. It does no apparent harm. No one will spend the night in the street if he can possibly help it, and if he is going to stay out of doors, he may as well be allowed to sleep, if he can. 2. The twopenny hangover. This comes a little higher than the embankment. At the twopenny hangover, the lodgers sit in a row on a bench. There's a rope in front of them, and they lean on this as though leaning over a fence. A man, humorously called the valet, cuts the rope at 5 in the morning. I have never been there myself, but Bozo has been there often. I asked him whether anyone could possibly sleep in such an attitude, and he said that it was more comfortable than it sounded, at any rate better than bare floor. There are similar shelters in Paris, but the charge there is only 25 centimes, a halfpenny, instead of 2 pence. 3. The coffin, at 4 pence a night. At the coffin you sleep in a wooden box with a tarpaulin for covering. It is cold, and the worst thing about it are the bugs, which, being enclosed in the box, you cannot escape. Above this comes the common lodging houses with charges varying between 7 pence and 1 and a penny a night. The best are the Rowton houses, where the charge is a shilling, for which you get a cubicle to yourself and the use of excellent bathrooms. You can also pay half a crown for a special, which is practically hotel accommodation. The Rowton houses are splendid buildings, and the only objection to them is the strict discipline, with rules against cooking, card-playing, etc. Perhaps the best advertisement for the Rowton houses is the fact that they are always full to overflowing. The Bruce houses, at 1 and a penny, are also excellent. Next best in point of cleanliness are the Salvation Army hostels at 7 pence or 8 pence. They vary. I have been in 1 or 2 that were not very unlike common lodging houses, but most of them are clean and they have good bathrooms. You have to pay extra for a bath, however. You can get a cubicle for a shilling. In the 8-penny dormitories, the beds are comfortable, but there are so many of them, as a rule at least 40 to a room, and so close together that it is impossible to get a quiet night. The numerous restrictions stink of prison and charity. The Salvation Army hostels would only appeal to people who put cleanliness before anything else. Beyond this, there are the ordinary common lodging houses. Whether you pay 7 pence or a shilling, they are all stuffy and noisy, and the beds are uniformly dirty and uncomfortable. What redeems them are their laissez-faire atmosphere and the warm home-like kitchens, where one can lounge at all hours of the day or night. They are squalid dens, but some kind of social life is possible in them. The women's lodging houses are said to be generally worse than the men's, and there are very few houses with accommodation for married couples. In fact, it is nothing out of the common for a homeless man to sleep in one lodging house and his wife in another. At this point, at least 15,000 people in London are living in common lodging houses. For an unattached man earning £2 a week or less, a lodging house is a great convenience. He could hardly get a furnished room so cheaply, and the lodging house gives him free firing, a bathroom of sorts, and plenty of society. As for the dirt, it is a minor evil. The really bad fault of lodging houses is that they are places in which one pays to sleep and in which sound sleep is impossible. All one gets for one's money is a bed measuring 5 feet 6 by 2 feet 6, with a hard convex mattress and a pillow like a block of wood, covered by one cotton counterpane and 2 gray stinking sheets. In winter, there are blankets, but never enough. And this bed is in a room where there are never less than 5, and sometimes 50 or 60 beds, a yard or 2 apart. Of course, no one can sleep soundly in such circumstances. The only other places where people are herded like this are barracks and hospitals. In the public wards of a hospital, no one even hopes to sleep well. In barracks, the soldiers are crowded, but they have good beds and they are healthy. In a common lodging house, nearly all the lodgers have chronic coughs, and a large number have bladder diseases, which make them get up at all hours of the night. The result is a perpetual racket, making sleep impossible. So far as my observation goes, no one in a lodging house sleeps more than 5 hours a night, a damnable swindle when one has paid 7 pence or more. Here, legislation could accomplish something. At present, there is all manner of legislation by the LCC about lodging houses, but it is not done in the interest of the lodgers. The LCC only exert themselves to forbid drinking, gambling, fighting, etc., etc. There is no law to say that the beds in a lodging house must be comfortable. This would be quite an easy thing to enforce, much easier, for instance, than restrictions upon gambling. The lodging house keepers should be compelled to provide adequate bedclothes and better mattresses, and above all, to divide their dormitories into cubicles. It does not matter how small a cubicle is. The important thing is that a man should be alone when he sleeps. These few changes, strictly enforced, would make an enormous difference. It is not impossible to make a lodging house reasonably comfortable at the usual rates of payment. In the Croydon Municipal Lodging House, where the charge is only 9 pence, there are cubicles, good beds, chairs, a very rare luxury in lodging houses, and kitchens above ground instead of in a cellar. There's no reason why every 9-penny lodging house should not come up to this standard. Of course, the owners of lodging houses would be opposed en bloc to any improvement, for their present business is an immensely profitable one. The average house takes £5 or £10 a night, with no bad debts, credit being strictly forbidden, and except for rent, the expenses are small. Any improvement would mean less crowding and hence less profit. Still, the excellent municipal lodging house at Croydon shows how well one can be served for 9 pence. A few well-directed laws could make these conditions general. If the authorities are going to concern themselves with lodging houses at all, they ought to start by making them more comfortable, not by silly restrictions that would never be tolerated in a hotel. Chapter 38. After we left the Spike at Lower Binfield, Paddy and I earned ½ a crown at weeding and sweeping in somebody's garden, stayed the night at Cromley, and walked back to London. I parted from Paddy a day or 2 later. B lent me a final £2, and as I had only another 8 days to hold out, that was the end of my troubles. My tame imbecile turned out worse than I had expected, but not bad enough to make me wish myself back in the Spike or the auberge de Giron-Cottard. Paddy set out for Portsmouth, where he had a friend who might conceivably find work for him, and I have never seen him since. A short time ago I was told that he had been run over and killed, but perhaps my informant was mixing him up with someone else. I had news of Bozo only 3 days ago. He is in Wansford, 14 days for begging. I do not suppose prison worries him very much. My story ends here. It is a fairly trivial story, and I can only hope that it has been interesting in the same way as a travel diary is interesting. I can say at least, here is the world that awaits you, if you are ever penniless. Some days I want to explore that world more thoroughly. I should like to know more people like Mario and Paddy and Bill the Moocher, not from casual encounters, but intimately. I should like to understand what really goes on in the souls of plongeurs and tramps and embankment sleepers. At present, I do not feel that I have seen more than the fringe of poverty. Still, I can point to one or two things I have definitely learned by being hard up. I shall never again think that all tramps are drunken scoundrels, nor expect a beggar to be grateful when I give him a penny, nor be surprised if men out of work lack energy, nor subscribe to the Salvation Army, nor pawn my clothes, nor refuse a handbill, nor enjoy a meal at a smart restaurant. That is a beginning.